At 3 in the morning, the world around Mark Sullivan felt like a room whose electricity had been cut. Familiar objects visible, but somehow drained of charge. The kitchen light glowed yellow behind the frosted glass, the refrigerator hummed in a low, flat note, and the clock above the stove declared the hour in small, indifferent digits. He sat on the back porch in a cheap lawn chair, knees pulled up, hands folded over the bones of his legs, and watched the sky clear between the houses. The silence that came down then was not the ordinary hush of night. It had a density, as if sound itself were thicker, reluctant to move. He had retired last spring, a lifetime of calibrations and tolerances folded into a drawer of manuals he no longer needed. As an engineer, Mark understood systems. He could see how a bridge might fatigue, how gears missed a beat and sent tremors down a whole mechanism. But the fatigue he felt now had nothing to do with a failing part or a worn seal. It was a hollowness that followed him from the breakfast table to the church basement to the mailbox, an internal corrosion that no inspection or checklist remedied. Elena slept beside him inside, her breathing steady, the years stacked between them like the settled weight of a house. Their marriage was fine by most measures: shared finances, vacations 10 years ago, a tidy yard. Yet when they ate dinner, they often sat like two islands, each with a small screen glowing between them, fingers flicking for headline after headline. Their conversations had become transmissions, updates and logistics, rather than exchanges. Mark noticed the scripted sentences before he even said them, felt the automaticity like a software routine running on autopilot. It made him feel like a technician looking at a machine running without heart. His son, James, had a family in another state and called less than he had 10 years earlier. When they spoke, he could feel the distance like a window pane, conversations safe and deflected, a series of smiling, untroubled platitudes offered to avoid the delicate contact of truth. Mark wondered, sometimes with a guilty humor, whether he had been a good father. The nights, though, were where the question sat the heaviest. He could not sleep long. He would wake at 2:17, 2:59, 3 o'clock. At 3, he would get up and go out to the yard because the house felt full of other people's air. On nights like this, he scanned the sky with a useless private vigilance. Once, years ago, as an engineer, young enough not to know better, he had looked up at the same stars and thought about trajectory and failure modes. Now his mind did not run diagnostics on bolts and load-bearing members. It ran small, grim mental lists of the things that seemed to vanish in the next generation. The slow erosion of patient listening, the way vulnerability was met by humor or dismissal, how people chose noise over being present to each other. Something about the silence that night felt like a diagnosis. He had just allowed that thought to complete. What would it mean if an entire species had learned to avoid itself, when there arrived a presence that was not a sound but a clarity? It descended not from the sky, but from within his chest, a slender, cool attention that felt like someone adjusting a dial on his awareness and reading the output. "You are recorded," said the presence. The voice was not heard with his ears. It arrived as an assertion, behind his teeth, a crisp line of information. It was neutral, stripped of human warmth and doubt, like a lab report delivered in the voice of a machine that had learned courtesy. Mark's first instinct was to reach for mechanical explanations: an episode of sleep paralysis, hypnagogia, too much late coffee. He rubbed his face, felt skin and whisker and the dry friction of sleep-deprived lids, and told himself he was being ridiculous. Then the thought came again, not in language he spoke, but in a pattern of image and proposition. "We intervened to preserve your continuity," it said.
We did not consent to your absence." The words landed like a foreign statute. We intervened. The grammar suggested a collective. The second clause, "to preserve your continuity," carried the strange implication that continuity was an artifact someone could monitor and protect. Mark's hands gripped his knees. In his professional life, he had learned to be cautious with evidence. This, whatever it was, felt like an assertion offered without ceremony. What follows is a claim. It is a narrative moment in his solitude, an experience inside his mind. The voice called itself seer. It would later name others and a collective, terms that in Mark's vocabulary did not fit neatly into the taxonomy of the merely possible. For now, Seer's presence was a crisp, clinical attentiveness that seemed to observe him the way a technician observes a sensitive instrument. "You are not under siege from outside," Seer said. "The danger you feared, nuclear holocaust, runaway asteroid, engineered disaster, was not the most pressing risk. Those are matters we have acted to prevent. We do not destroy you. We prevent the mechanisms that would extinguish biological continuity. We cannot, however, make you feel." There was no melodrama to Seer's voice. It was an accounting. It explained as if listing causes and effects on a whiteboard. External threats averted, internal work required. The cadence was terse, as if even emotion might be considered an unnecessary variable. Mark felt disbelief, then a kind of stubborn curiosity. What are you?" he wanted to say aloud, but the question translated into an almost scientific compliance inside his head. Identify, define, locate. The presence moved in a different grammar. "We are a federation of attention," Seer said. "Think of us as a collective intelligence that learned to monitor the chance of your species' physical survival and to intercede when necessary. We made an agreement with your species.
We offered a safeguard for your body on the condition that you would choose freely to repair what was eroding within. An agreement, a trade-off. Those were words Mark understood intellectually. Contracts, terms, constraints. But something deeper tugged at him. The idea that a species could make a pact that extended beyond the political or familial. A covenant with an intelligence motivated not by dominion, but by preservation. The math of the claim was staggering and oddly bureaucratic, an agency that kept ledger entries on extinction probabilities. As shown to Mark, there came then a series of visions, short, flaring sequences like film frames projected into the hollow of his attention. Seer did not narrate like a storyteller. It offered snapshots with the clinical cool of a historian presenting evidence. A boardroom in gray light, two men in close conversation, a finger on a red phone, tense faces, a hand that almost moved to press a button and then did not. The image crystallized and vanished. A rocket that did not ignite as planned, an asteroid's arc altered by a shadow in the sky, a lone sensor that returned a false positive, diverting the course of action. A man in a tiny control room in another country's midnight, flicking a switch that averted catastrophe by a fraction of a degree. He woke the next morning unsure of what he had just done. He later remembered a dream of falling and being caught by invisible hands. These were presented not as proof. The voice never asked Mark to accept them as factual history, but as visions shown to him, a selection of events Seer linked to its interventions. It used the past as if it had a ledger.
It spoke of hundreds of such moments, of 154 recorded interventions, of 23 instances where extinction probabilities dropped precipitously after contact. Numbers fell from the presence with the same dryness as a technician stating tolerances. They saved you from certain physical ends, Seer said. They saved the possibility of your life continuing, but continuation is not the same as thriving. The agreement prescribed that you must find yourselves from within. You must choose to develop, through inner labor, capacities we cannot compel. Compel. The word shaped itself into something moral. Free will, a non-negotiable parameter of this agreement. Seer insisted that whatever protections they can deploy, shelters for species, shifts in trajectories, interference with external catastrophic mechanisms, if people refuse the inner work, no external act could substitute for felt presence. It was, in its way, an elegant cruelty. Safety paired with the requirement that humans face their own emptiness unassisted. Mark thought of his own emptiness, not as abstraction now, but as a wound. He felt exposed by the elegant cruelty. Why me? He asked inwardly, and the presence answered with an economy that felt like an engineer's rationale. You are a node, it said.
You are the demographic that carries weight in patterns of influence. Middle-aged men between 50 and 65 produce outsized cultural effects in the social architecture of your communities. Your choices ripple. The phrase node reduced human relationships to circuitry. It also, oddly, affirmed his significance. Mark had not felt significant in months, maybe years. The voice's assertion woke something like responsibility, an uncomfortable, clean-edged obligation he did not know how to carry. The presence did not shame. It presented data and then waited. We cannot prescribe salvation, Seer continued. We can only prescribe work. Your species has 28 years, the presence said. 28 years from now is the deadline in our projections for which the probability of emotional atrophy becoming self-propagating reaches a point of irreversible feedback in our models. If 3% of your population truly engages the interior work required, if 3% chooses beyond social habit, then the model shows a reversal of the decline. Mark could feel the parentheses in that sentence, in our projections, in our models. The presence framed its claims as data from its perspective. Still, the numbers lodged in him like bolts. 28 years, 3%. He had spent his life calibrating tolerances. These were tolerances for a species. You will not be forced, Seer said. We will not intervene in interior states. That would violate the terms we imposed to make this agreement ethical. You must choose to feel. You must choose to be present. The revelation lodged in Mark like a stone in his chest. He remembered the early days of his marriage when he had sat on the back steps with Elena and talked at length about nothing and everything. Those conversations had thinned incrementally until the default posture at dinner had become avoiding depth to avoid discomfort. He thought of James and the way his son had learned, perhaps from him, to manage feeling with jokes and vagueness. What Seer described as the hidden cost was now visible in his own life. The species saved from death, but increasingly anesthetized within its own social tissues. Mark's engineer's mind started listing failure modes, social systems optimized for efficiency, entertainment scaffolding that dampened loneliness rather than resolving it, chronically partial attention that made real presence a rare event.
These were not abstract deficits, but behaviors that could be diagnosed and perhaps changed. Sear's voice shifted then from report to suggestion. It did not issue commandments, only proposals. Begin with silence, it said. 20 minutes each morning without devices. Attend to the field of your own attention. Sit with the emptiness and do not flee it. Nightly, sit with your partner. 15 minutes of presence without screens, without rehearsal. Weekly, join a group devoted to honest vulnerability. You will find resistance. The ego will narrate reasons.
Persistence matters more than intensity. These were simple instructions, and because they were simple, almost unbearable. Mark imagined trying them. 20 minutes of silence in a life designed around tasks and fixes? 15 minutes of unmediated presence with Elena, who had learned to keep the conversation light. Weekly confessionals with neighbors? The prescriptions sounded like a routine that would require him to take apart habits more effectively installed than any rusted bolt he had ever replaced. He thought of the men he knew, the old colleagues from the plant, Harold next door who mowed his lawn at dawn, the faded small-town veterans who met at the diner for coffee and avoided talk of pain like a contagious disease. Were they nodes too? If change needed to flow upstream, did he imagine himself wading into that current? The presence anticipated his resistance. The difficulty is the point, Sear said. The friction is the mechanism. The work is not comfortable because it requires breaking autopilot. It will feel like an erosion. You will think you are losing something. You are not. You are uncovering capacity. Mark's ribs tightened at the metaphor. Erosion and uncovering. The same word could mean both loss and liberation, depending on which hand did the work. He had a half-formed memory then of a time when intimacy had been easier, an afternoon when he and Alina had sat on a porch and laughed until their throats hurt, a small domestic reckoning, nothing cinematic, simply two people dawdling in truth. He could see his father's face then, the way his father had rarely spoken about regrets, but had been present in small ways, a hand at the shoulder, a quiet acceptance. Mark's father was gone now, but the pattern of a life carried forward like a series of engineering blueprints, an inheritance of habits and omissions. Sear's projections returned to the ledger. If 3% engages, it said, then new norms can emerge. You cannot require everyone to awaken. The model assumes variability, noise, resistance, but the field of influence is nonlinear. Small clusters can seed larger cultural changes. Mark wanted to test the math with the same sober curiosity he brought to any technical challenge. He imagined a town of 10,000. 3% was 300 people. If 3,000 awakened, perhaps the threshold would shift. The presence did not encourage delusion. It encouraged action, repeated and modest. The visions shifted again, now less like historical movie clips and more like everyday scenes Mark recognized as symptoms of the internal collapse Sear described. He saw a couple in a suburban kitchen, elbows on the counter, texting each other across the same room. He saw a man in a dim living room scrolling through a feed, the hours collapsing until morning light. A teenager in a car, the radio an unmoving wall. A pastor who looked exhausted after meeting the endless needs of his congregation and had no one to tell him his own story. These were not dramatic ruptures, but small erosions, cumulative leakages that, over a generation, had altered the social architecture. Is there a root cause? Mark asked into the wideness of that presence. Why did it happen? Sear answered with the clinical detachment of a researcher describing a complex system's cascade failure. No singular root, it said, a multitude.
industrial rhythms that favor productivity over presence, technologies that replace embodied contact with mediated substitutes, cultural norms that reward performance and penalize vulnerability, an educational arc that prizes information over relational skill. Add to that the natural tendency of systems toward efficiency. People learn to conserve emotional energy by performing safe scripts rather than risking connection. Over time, the avoidance compounds. The analysis felt plausible. It was also merciless in its clarity. Mark thought of every time he had chosen brevity over candor, every joke that covered shame, every evening when the television served as a buffer against conversation. He felt, for the first time in a long while, a desire that did not come from inertia, to try. After the first visitations nights later, because the presence returned more than once, appearing not as a spectacle, but as a persistent line of communication, Sears' suggestions took on practical shape. It spoke of the pain of the first weeks. Sleep might worsen temporarily as the mind, freed from distraction, surfaced feelings. Old habits would insist themselves as rational reasons to abandon practice. Social friends might mock or laugh. It warned against perfectionism and against seeking quick neurological fixes. It framed the practices as training a muscle. Do not expect results before the labor, Sears said. Expect discomfort. Expect small clarities. Expect that you might cry. Expect that someone you love will misinterpret what you are doing and ask if you are losing your mind. Mark heard that last line with a wry, hurt smile. He had, once, been accused of losing his mind, only in his case it had been loving concern circled like a radar dish. The presence, clinical and unblinking, did not romanticize the journey. When Sears finally receded, it left Mark with a residue of astonishment and a peculiar sense of accountability. The night had thinned into dawn. The kitchen clock read 4:23. Elena would be up soon, moving through the routine of the house, her body a familiar territory he wanted to cross again, but was no longer sure how. He raised himself from the lawn chair and walked toward the house with the slow deliberateness of someone who had not yet decided whether to carry anything with him back into ordinary life. He did not tell Elena that morning, not in full. Instead, he brought a cup of coffee to her, set it on the bedside table, and sat on the edge of the bed. Their conversation was careful at first, both of them tasting the language for danger.
Then, at a small risk, one he had not taken in a long while, he told her he had been awake in the night. "Couldn't sleep," he said. She turned and looked at him. For a moment there was nothing but the human fact of her eyes. "It's that thing again, isn't it?" she said, not accusing, but naming. He nodded. Telling her about the voice felt like exposing a nerve. It said we were saved from a lot of outside things, but we weren't saved from this. He used an index finger to point at the empty space between them, at all the unsaid things that gathered there. Elena did not laugh. She did not roll her eyes. She listened in the way one listens at the edge of a hazard. She had not had a visitor in the night. For her the claim would be theory. For Mark it was experience. He felt the gulf between theory and experience as a chasm he now had to bridge within the intimacy of their marriage. "Maybe," Elena said finally, "we could try something, for you, for us." The words were thin, hesitant, but they were a crossing. Mark felt gratitude and fear in equal measure. He thought of Sears' proposed prescriptions and felt the immediate jolt of resistance. 20 minutes of silence in the morning sounded like a punishment to habits etched by decades. He also felt a spark of possibility, a practical lever within his reach. At the local hardware store on a dull Wednesday, poring over paint chips for the porch, he found himself watching Harold, the man from 2 houses down, who was unpacking a bag of nails and humming an old song under his breath. Harold waved with the elbow of a man who has been taught not to speak his heart. What would Harold say if Mark asked him to come to a weekly group to talk about fear? Mark had no idea, but he thought of the word node again, how influence traveled along seams of ordinary acquaintanceship, and felt an anxious optimism. If the cost Seer spoke of was real, the remedy would not be dramatic in the way of heroics. It would be the glacial, patient work of people sitting together in rooms, saying true things, letting silence be tolerable not by filling it with noise, but by learning to endure it. Mark imagined a room with folding chairs and coffee, a circle of men like him opening their hands to old hurts and to the thin possibility of repair. The image scared him. It also felt like an achievable step. He began with small experiments. He set the alarm for 20 minutes earlier than usual and sat in the kitchen with his hands folded, facing the window that gave on to the backyard where the maple tree had started to bud. He turned off the radio. He left his phone in a drawer. The first mornings were torturous. His mind, habituated to a near-constant chatter, raised objections like a machine tripping on faulty input. You could use the time for yard work, the voice suggested. You could check one more email. You could plan the day.
He practiced noticing the objections as they arose, and then returning his attention to the body of his breath, the seat of the chair, the gentle creak of the floorboards. Sometimes, in those 20 minutes, a grief would quietly thud into place and begin to open. He would feel a flush of shame, and then the slow rain of memory. The face of his father when he would not speak of sorrow. Elena's look when she had once tried to tell him about a fear and had received humor as deflection. Tears came once without fanfare. He let them fall, awkward, without meta-narrative. The world did not fracture. It simply felt more honest. At night, he tried the 15 minutes with Elena. They sat on the couch, their devices off, and for a time the silence hung between them like a live wire. Elena sometimes started to rehearse what she would say, small talk, kitchen logistics, but Mark would gently put a hand on her arm and invite a return to presence. It was a fumbling art. They both stumbled over awkwardness, laughed at memory, then returned to a place that wanted neither to be filled nor to be empty. He felt sometimes like an engineer resoldering a connection between two wires that had been insulated for years. Word of his small changes moved like rumor. Harold asked with a half-sincere curiosity what had made him look 10 years younger in 3 weeks. The neighbor who had always nodded at the mailbox came over to say, "You okay these days? You seem different." Mark began to speak directly about the practice in measured doses, careful not to evangelize, but not to hide the thing that had started to shift. At the church basement, a small sign-up sheet grew a name here and there for a weekly men's conversation group, a low-budget attempt at vulnerability with coffee and boxed donuts. Mark called Harold and asked him to come. Harold hesitated, laughed, and then agreed. It took 6 men to start a sustained group. It took Harold 3 months before he spoke about his father's death without the usual jokes. When he did, the room did not collapse. It breathed with him. None of these victories were swift or tidy. There were nights of old habits, nights when a friend's tease made him pull back into safe modes of joking rather than stay with the sting. James called once, and Mark could hear the guarded tones. Their conversation was careful, but there was one honest exchange about fear, about the worry of being emotionally inadequate, and it lasted longer than either of them expected. James said, not blithely, but with a small wounding humility, "I'm tired of pretending I'm the capable one all the time." Mark listened. He did not fix. He let his son speak. Afterwards, James thanked him in a way that had less polished armor and more rawness than Mark remembered receiving from his son in years. As these small openings appeared, Mark kept remembering Seer's numbers. He thought of the 28-year horizon as both pressure and patience. The deadline felt like a cliff just over the horizon. The work felt like the plodding strides one takes toward a plane that is easy to miss if distracted. He imagined a social graph, nodes pulsing in slow rhythms of connection and withdrawal. He could see how a few people's choice to show up differently might alter the topology of the network. But even as the rope of small successes knit into a modest pattern, Mark could not shake a tremor of fear. What if the model was right, and 3% was a threshold he could not help reach? What if the effort of a few men in folding chairs was like trying to plug a century of systemic erosion with an old calendar? At times, the emergency of the claim felt like too great a weight for one life. That tension between the enormity of the claim and the ordinariness of the remedy pressed on him every morning as he sat with his breath. The practices felt like tiny levers under a mountain. One evening, in a clearer audial memory of the original revelation, Seer's voice returned, not as a lecture, but as a reminder. "We did not come to save you from the inner task," Seer said. "We came to make sure you have time to do it. The decision remains yours. We are not arbiters of your soul." Those last words, "not arbiters of your soul," sat in Mark like a benediction and a rebuke. The alien presence, clinical and distant, had offered an accounting and a prescription. It had left the rest to human hands. The hidden cost, Seer had said, was that humanity would not be allowed to die physically, but it would be compelled to choose its interiors. The domestic world resumed around him. The routine of bills, groceries, and Thursday night television. The outer rhythms were familiar scaffolding. Within those scaffolds, Mark began to do small experiments again. He kept a notebook where he wrote what happened in his 20 minutes, what came up in his 15 nightly minutes with Elena, what surfaced in the men's group around the coffee urn. Progress was not linear. He had evenings when the old defenses clicked back into place. He had a day when an old unresolved anger at his father flared so hot he could not breathe. He called Harold and sat on the stoop in the cold while Harold told him of a regret he had hidden for years. The talk did not fix everything, but it did not gossip about the past to avoid feeling. It met the past as it was. The ripple extended slowly. James called more often, at odd hours. Once James showed up on the porch unannounced, eyes rimmed red, and sat with Mark until dawn. Elena started taking time on Sunday afternoons to sit with a neighbor who had lost her husband, and Mark felt pride that did not strain into smugness, but was the soft warmth of witnessing a neighbor's grief shared. Yet the ledger Seer had described was still present in the world at large. At a town hall, Mark listened as speakers declaimed about budgets and infrastructure with the same intensity of people talking about something that could not be felt. Advertising offered pleasures that did not invite presence. Technology companies released devices that promised behavioral miracles. The systemic forces that had pushed people toward emotional short-circuiting were not inert. They had corporate and cultural momentum. Late one night, after a particularly raw session with the men's group, where Harold had broken down over a divorce he had never talked about, Mark lay awake and felt the weight of possibility and peril colliding. The visions Sire had shown him earlier came back, a sober image of a species that, in avoiding one kind of extinction, had accepted another, internal, slow, insidious. He thought of the 28 years like an arc of time in which the choice was made visible. A different kind of silence arrived that night, not the heavy outer hush of the first visitation, but a quieter, expectant pause, like a breath held before an orchestra begins a new piece. Mark wondered whether the choice would be made by enough people. He suspected that the answer would not be cinematographic, but domestic. People choosing to sit together with honest hearts in kitchens and basements and church halls. "If you are listening to this," a thought threaded through him, Sire had said, "you are invited." Mark felt in that sentence the pull of the ordinary and the extraordinary at once. The alien's revelation had shone a light on a cost no one wanted to admit, being alive without feeling alive. But it had also left the map scratched in pencil, simple practices, small gatherings, persistence. He stood at the threshold between what had been and what might be. The next week, he would go to the hardware store and buy an inexpensive clock to sit on the mantel, to remind him of the minutes he now guarded. He would call James and revisit the conversation about what it means to be present. He would test his own nerve in front of the men's group when the prompt came, "When did you last cry in front of someone who mattered?" The task ahead was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It required a steady habit of returning, 1,000 small acts that looked nothing like the drama of movies. It required him to be ordinary and brave. Mark rubbed his forehead and in the half-light allowed himself a private acknowledgement. He was afraid. He was also strangely alive to the fear. That, he thought, might be the point. The presence in the night had revealed the hidden cost of a pact he had not known existed. The cost had been clarity and a task. Choose to feel or allow presence to recede further from the species that had been preserved physically. Soon the sun would rise. He walked to the window, watching the sky lighten from deep indigo to the pale, determined blue of morning. In the kitchen, Elena was making coffee, and the house hummed with the small, ordinary noises of life. Water pouring, a cupboard closing, the soft radio in the other room playing something gentle. Mark paused at the threshold and did not speak. He watched his wife move and felt the rawness of wanting to say more than he did. For now, the change lived in small experiments and a private ledger of minutes and tears. The world had not shifted in the way he had once secretly hoped, and yet something in the architecture of his life had begun to reconfigure. The alien's revelation, the title that might have seemed theatrical if it had been delivered by strangers, had landed on his porch and rewritten the terms of his nights. He took a breath, and in that breath he made a small, quiet commitment to return to the chair the next night, to the silence, to the awkwardness with Elena, to the men in folding chairs who were learning to tell true things. He did not promise a miracle, he promised presence. Outside, the maple tree opened its leaves in the patient geometry of spring. Inside, on a kitchen counter, the cheap clock ticked, 1 second at a time. The ledger of small acts had begun. Days folded into the habit of minutes. Mark kept the cheap mantel clock he had bought and wound a small ritual around it. 20 minutes at dawn, 15 at dusk, a notebook kept under the lamp with scrawled entries that read more like field notes than a journal. He recorded the resistances, how the mind offered errands as moral imperatives, how his hands felt twitchy in the first week of practice, as if an unused muscle had been called into duty. He wrote down the sensations that came without narrative, the hollow that sighed open like a seam, the sudden warmth behind the sternum, the way his throat tightened when an old memory stepped into the room. He tried not to write prescriptions, only observations, the way an engineer keyed data into a logbook without conclusion. The men's group met in the church basement because the church had the cheapest coffee and the most forgiving light. The folding chairs were lined in a circle, the coffee was always too bitter, and the box doughnuts were stale in the honest way of communal breakfasts. It began, as things like this often do, with awkwardness. Men shuffled in with hands in pockets, shoulders hunched against the admission of otherness. A retired school teacher with chipped nails, a highway mechanic with oil-gnarled hands, a man who wore a suit out of habit, though he no longer had a job that required one. Harold with his stooped back, and a joke always at the mouth ready, but jokes had a softer edge now, as if they were tests to probe whether the room would hold pain. They called themselves a vulnerability circle, more as an experiment than a declaration. Mark remembered Sears' phrasing, "Weekly join a group devoted to honest vulnerability," and felt the instruction like a blueprint whose materials he had to improvise.
On the first night, he read a short passage from his notebook, the entry about the impulse to fix rather than listen, and then he sat down and felt the room measure his risk. Harold, who had been the last to agree to come, surprised him. Harold spoke about driving past a cemetery one cold morning and feeling a fierce, almost animal shame. He had, Harold said, spent 40 years holding jokes like a shield. His voice cracked somewhere around the confession, and the room did not recoil. It leaned in. That leaning was the beginning of an ecology. Men came and left and came back. The group discovered rules by trial more than intention. No problem solving unless asked for, no minimizations, a willingness to sit in silence if the words did not come. The first time Harold cried, it was a small, private sound he tried to smother with a cough. The second time, he simply inhaled and let the cry run through him like a current. Someone passed him a napkin. There were no speeches about healing. There was only the work of showing up and the surprise of not collapsing under the weight of other people's pain. Mark noticed physiology respond. His nights lengthened in small increments of sleep. He started waking at 5:30 rather than 2:59. That change arrived without fanfare, a fuller morning, a lighter fog behind the eyes. He did not attribute it to any single exercise. He recorded it as correlation, careful about causality. Elena noticed that he seemed calmer in small ways, that he did not flinch when she mentioned an old embarrassment. She found herself telling him a story about a woman at the grocery store who had dropped eggs and how she had been too hurried to help. Elena used to tell these little sprites of narrative as if to test the water. Now she demanded, with a soft insistence, that someone listen. James called more often, and the conversations shifted not because Mark employed a technique, but because he let himself be less in a rush. One evening, James spoke about his work, not in the perfunctory way of a man delivering status updates, but with a tone that admitted fatigue. He said he had begun to feel the shape of things he had avoided all his life, the pressure to perform, the tendency to smooth out any trace of weakness. "I think my wife sees it," James said. "She tells me I'd barked at the kids for nothing the other night, and—" he let out a short laugh that sounded like surrender. "I don't like being that guy." Mark did not offer a lecture. He listened, and between one breath and the next, he said something like, "I hear you. That must be hard." It felt like the flattest response and also the truest. Later, when James drove up one Friday with coffee and a worn sweatshirt that smelled of machine oil and an exhausted honesty, they sat on the porch and did not fill the quiet with jokes as they used to. James asked about grief, about not wanting to be the person who never cracks. The conversation bent toward the messy truth of not knowing. They did not resolve what was unresolved in one dusk. They only practiced the small generosity of unguarded attention. Afterwards, James stayed a little longer in town, came back for family dinners, called more often. None of it in tidy arcs, all of it in incremental rewiring. Resistance remained the constant companion. Mark's first month contained a spate of setbacks that felt, in the moment, like betrayals. He would lapse into the old habit of empty noise, the television turned on as soon as he walked through the door, the phone set in his palm like a talisman.
He had mornings when the 20 minutes felt like exile. One day his son James called, and they fell into a scaffolding of jokes that covered both pain. After the call, Mark felt oddly relieved, until guilt followed close behind. The ego, Sayre had warned, was a persuasive operator. It would invent rational imperatives to keep itself insulated. Outside forces also tested the nascent pattern. A local columnist, bored and hungry for a small controversy, wrote a tepid piece about the town's new men's club and made a joke about retirees airing grievances. The piece drew a handful of mocking comments online. One man from the group dropped out, unnerved by the idea of being seen as soft in a town that prized resilience as stoicism. Mark had to sit with the disappointment and the publicity slip. Vulnerability sometimes invites scorn. The group's dignity was not in proclaiming success, but in continuing despite ridicule. At the edge of these small dramas, the ledger Sayre had provided kept returning to Mark's mind. 28 years still unspooled ahead like a rope with knots to be learned. He imagined the model, a curve that crested if the right number of people engaged, and felt both urgency and the absurdity of human time. 65 would be closer than it seemed. He would turn 60 in a few years, and the notion that the demographic labeled nodes was also his cohort pressed on him. He felt like a bolt in a great seam, and the seam could either hold more tightly or tear under load. For all the hum of ordinary strain, public signs of shift appeared. A neighbor who had been the sort to scoff at heart talk emailed him, curious about a reading group on presence and attention that Mark proposed at the library. A pastor he had long respected called to ask if he might bring a small group of men from his congregation to the circle. The church basement began to host new faces, young fathers, a woman who had come not for the men but to hear them, and the shape of the circle transformed. It was no longer an isolated experiment, but a modest node in a widening network. One late autumn evening, as the light thinned early and the boiler in the church groaned, the group convened, and a man named Luis, younger than most, told a story that changed the tone of the room. Luis worked nights at the hospital, and between the monotony and urgency had learned to be a man of practical competence. He had, he said, laughed for years when friends broached feelings. He had come that night because his sister, who had been in and out of depression, had asked him to try. "I didn't think I'd have anything to say," he told them. "I thought I'd listen, maybe nod. Then I got to talk about my father's hands. I didn't even know my hands were afraid until then." The room listened. Someone nodded. There were no grand epiphanies. It was instead a small moment, a young man allowed to speak of fear, and the group receiving it without flinching, that marked a change in the social climate of the circle. It signaled that vulnerability could cross generational lines, and that the group's habits were forming not in spite of difference, but because of it. With each meeting, Mark learned more about the delicate craft of holding a room. He learned how to name the practices, breathing anchors, listening without offering solutions, ritual closing that returned the men to ordinary life with some small centering. These were not sacred secrets, but practical techniques that protected the fragile work from dissolving into advice-giving. Harold became a quiet steward of the group's spirit. He would arrive early to reheat the coffee and stay late to help stack chairs. When he spoke of his wife and the ways he had avoided grief, there was less embarrassment now and more gratitude that someone had given him space to land. Mark also wrote. The practice of morning silence had given him clarity enough to render observations into prose. He was not a writer by trade, but the notebook swelled, and one night Elena, reading an entry over his shoulder, suggested he share the ideas wider. "You should put it in a pamphlet," she said. Not a book, just something you can hand people without making them feel exposed. He did as she suggested and printed 50 leaflets on the home printer with the title Minutes That Matter and a short description of the 3 practices: 20 minutes of morning silence, 15 minutes of nightly presence, weekly honest group. The pamphlets were unpolished, the design clumsy, but their content was straightforward and offered no guarantees, only invitation and a caution about resistance. He distributed them at the library, at the coffee shop, at the church basement. Some were taken with awkward gratitude. Some were folded and placed on counters and forgotten. A few were read and returned with notes of thanks. The reaction was uneven enough to be human and encouraging. One evening, a woman who ran a community center called and asked if Mark would speak briefly about the practice to a group of middle-aged men who met there. He agreed, terrified and grateful in equal measure. Appearances like that were small ripples, but multiplied by enough repetition could become a tide. Mark thought of networks and Sayre's metaphor of nodes and influence. He imagined charts and edges, the way one decision amplified through neighbors, workplaces, and families. He did not imagine this as a conversion campaign. He imagined instead a method of contagion that relied on contagion being a human thing, people seeing something that worked and trying it. Sayre returned from time to time, not to lecture, but to calibrate Mark's understanding. The presence appeared in moments of real uncertainty, when a scandal threatened to close a group, or when a public figure mocked vulnerability on television and hundreds of comments ridiculed the idea. The alien's voice was always cool and clinical, reminders of scale and constraint. Once, after a week where the town's paper carried a long mocking column, Sayre said, "We cannot correct for the cultural speed of denigration. Our models do not capture ridicule well." The comment was neither cruel nor consoling. It was data. "Do you watch the variables?" Mark asked once, in the space where words from his throat turned inward. "We monitor metrics of continuation," Sayre said. "We do not monitor the interior choices of individuals, except as macro aggregates in projection." The presence offered numbers again, estimates, probabilities, always framed within its posture as an observer. The clinical vocabulary made Mark's hair stand on end. It felt like someone calculating when a bridge's welds might fail and offering a graph instead of a prayer. Still, there were moments when the alien's projections translated into a visceral image that gripped him. One night, after a particularly raw group session where a younger man confessed to a near miss with alcoholism, Sayre offered a vignette, a city in which people communicated through devices that smoothed emotional fluctuations, in which funerals happened with scheduled grief slots and automated consolations that obviated the messy work of presence. It was not a dramatic apocalypse. It was a society that functioned, clean, efficient, and toneless, because it had outsourced the burden of feeling to protocols and mediators. Children learned scripts for sympathy in middle school. Intimacy existed as a feature to be downloaded and updated. People woke with full bellies and no ache. The presentation was cold and clinical, and the chill it left behind was that of a model that had no ethics beyond continuation. Mark felt the image like a shiver through his bones. He imagined a world in which the species did not die physically, but where the ability to hold grief, to sustain tenderness, to sit with quiet sorrow no longer existed. He thought of funerals without tears and handshakes that were programmed to last 20 seconds. The future was practical and functional. It was also empty in ways that made the skin prickle. That image became, for Mark, the worst kind of warning, not an explosion, but a flattening. At the same time, Sear showed other projections, scenarios where clusters of people engaged in persistent practice and, over decades, shifted local norms.
In those projections, a town like his maintained robust civic life because people had learned how to be present to one another's sorrow and joy. The difference between the two models was not heroic drama, but a slow and steady accumulation of practices in households, in workplaces, in schools. That pattern appealed to Mark because it matched his engineering sensibility. Small tolerances in many places could become the foundation for resilience. The 3% threshold loomed in public conversation more often now, sometimes spoken as a kind of folk statistic tossed into local cafes as if it were a weather report. It became a yardstick for imaginary campaigns. "We need 3%, someone would say with exaggerated optimism, and then a joke. These half-serious refrains irritated Mark at first because they made the ledger sound like a political target. He was careful to keep the work away from manifestos. The point was not to tally converts, but to tend to the quality of contact where it already happened. One winter, the group grew bolder. They organized a presence fair of sorts at the community center, a series of small stations that taught listening practices, demonstrations of the morning silence, and a space to practice the 15-minute presence with a partner. The fair was amateur and sincere. People wandered in, some mocking at first, others curious. A young mother lingered at the listening table with a toddler on her hip and began to cry when someone offered her uninterrupted attention for the first time in months. A retiree confessed that he had always feared being tender and left with a pamphlet and a crooked smile. The fair's success was not in numbers, but in the unusual willingness of people to try things that did not promise immediate efficiency. Mark's pamphlet had evolved into a short booklet with practice instructions, cautionary notes about expected resistance, and suggestions for how to form small circles. It was not a book of grand theories, but a practical ledger of how to begin. Elena edited it with a woman's patience for tone. She excised anything that smelled of patronizing remedy. Mark printed a larger run, more clumsy layout but cleaner language, and put a stack at the library. A librarian who had read the booklet called him one Sunday and said, "This one line, 'Presence is skill, not virtue,' hit me." The phrase pleased Mark because it reframed the moral tension into a craft. As the local efforts multiplied, so did cautionary edges. There were nights when he read about political agitators using the language of presence to mobilize men into reactionary projects, flattening the practice into rallying cry. That appropriation terrified him because it showed how easily a practice could be co-opted into performance or weaponized. He thought of Sayre's warning. The Federation could not force interior work. The responsibility fell to human hands to protect the quality and ethics of the practice. He found himself in conversations about boundaries, how to keep groups from sliding into macho rhetoric, how to ensure that vulnerability did not become a tool of social manipulation. Through all this, his relationship with Elena deepened in small domestic ways that were more palpable than any public success. They started to schedule a no-screen hour before bed, and more importantly, the 15 minutes of unadorned presence. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they held hands and watched the television, but with their phones downstairs. Elena began to tell him small fears she had not voiced in years. Mark started to own the ways he had dampened her pain with jokes rather than being with it. There were setbacks, nights when one of them would default to habit, a hurt left to cool. But the pattern persisted enough to create trust where there had been distance. One Thanksgiving, when James arrived early and the house smelled of turkey and wood smoke, he found his father in the kitchen kneading dough with an odd, focused tenderness. The son debated whether to remark on the domestic quiet.
In the living room, Elena and Mark practiced their 15 minutes, and James, watching, felt something unpenning in him. At dinner, he asked, almost as if trying a new muscle, about the men's group. Mark told him about the meetings, the awkwardness, the pieces of hard truth. James listened, and then, in a voice that caught at the edges, told a story about being a child and worrying that every adult in his life had to be capable. He admitted, with a kind of liberated shame, that he had been tired of covering up the cracks. They did not make a spectacle of reconciliation. There were no cinematic embraces. Instead, there was the slow rhythm of conversation that lasted longer than habit allowed. James stayed the whole weekend, and on the last morning he helped his father fix a leaky gutter, and they talked in companionable silence, hands busy, the old engineerhood finding a new vessel in the simple act of repair. Mark's life in that season felt like a series of small renovations. He repaired relationships and practices rather than structural systems. He learned to accept the limits of his influence. He kept a careful ledger of boundaries. He would not preach in ways that shamed. He would not claim the practices took fewer than the hours they required. He resisted the temptation to narrate the work as heroic. Heroism, he decided, was often a public performance and not the quiet persistence the task required. The most significant test came 3 years into his deliberate practice. The town experienced, in quick succession, a set of layoffs at a local plant and a prominent local scandal that splashed across regional news. Anxiety rose like weather. Talk shows buzzed. Social media turned spiteful. Rituals of scapegoating quickened. The men's group faced a crisis point. Would the circle dissolve into mutual enmeshment with the town's rancor, or would it hold as a place to practice presence in the storm? At the next meeting, a man named Tom, who lost his job at the plant, arrived with the sort of raw fury that makes group spaces flinch. He spoke a long, hot sentence about betrayal and the unfairness of life, and then, somewhere in the middle of his tirade, began to cry. The room had to do a small and delicate thing, contain empathy and not rush toward platitudes. Mark thought of Sears' words about friction being the mechanism. The group practiced presence as an art that night, holding Tom's pain without turning it into a sermon, offering him unembellished listening and pragmatic help where needed. Tom later told Mark that it was the first time in weeks he had felt less alone in the swirl. These small reconfigurations rippled outward. A local teacher, noticing the difference in a group of students who had been taught listening practices, proposed a pilot in a high school homeroom. The school board responded with measured interest rather than derision. The tentacles of practice extended where people had time and will to try. Not everything bent toward hope. There were losses, friends who dropped away, a short-lived attempt at a larger presence conference that folded under the weight of logistics. Mark learned that movement is not linear and that propaganda does not equal transformation. The danger of mistaking social exposure for inner change was constant. He reinforced the principle that the work was private and slow, not promotional. He refused, on principle, to monetize the group's vulnerability into products or promises. Even the booklet remained a free artifact available at the library. As the years unfurled, Sears' interjections grew less frequent but sharper when they came. The presence would arrive on nights when Mark felt particularly vulnerable and would offer clinical glimpses of trend lines. In one such visit, Sears presented a projection labeled Trajectories. The image was not cinematic, it was a split graph. One curve plotted a slow flattening of emotional engagement if current patterns continued. Another plotted a subtle inflection, an upward bend that emerged only after repeated small increases in household-level practice. Sear's voice was cool as ever. The system's rate constants change with cultural shifts, it said. Local clusters of practice alter the coupling coefficients of social bonds. Small, persistent changes compound. Then it added, as if reading a margin note, "This is not destiny, it is probability." It was that probabilistic framing that kept Mark anchored to humility. The ledger he kept was not a manifesto, but a record of possibilities. He preached to himself, and sometimes to the circle, the discipline of modesty. The work was not salvation in a cosmic sense, it was a method of restoring capacity to feel.
That modesty protected against fanaticism. At some point, the town's pattern shifted enough that the regional media began to notice. A journalist from a larger paper wrote a piece about the quiet civic initiatives thriving in small towns, citing Mark's group as a low-key exemplar. The article was neither triumphalist nor dismissive. It described a small culture of listening that had taken root. For Mark, the attention was ambivalent. He resisted the idea that publicity equaled impact, but he did not mind the fact that the fold of the circle grew by a few members from neighboring towns. With growth came the need to anchor ethics and practice. He developed, with the help of the group's most steady members, a short code. 3 principles: presence, confidentiality, and consent. The principles were not theology. They were pragmatic measures to keep the work from dissolving into display. Despite the local momentum, the wider world still offered evidence of the flattening Sear had described. Corporate dashboards designed to measure happiness metrics proliferated, and there were devices that promised optimized mood with algorithmic nudges. The temptation to substitute engineered feeling for felt presence was powerful. Mark thought of those technologies and felt a cautious skepticism. Devices could assist certain capacities, but they could not replicate the unedited exchange of human sorrow and care. The distinction mattered because the Federation, Sear had said, could not force interior work. Technology often made the promise of easy interior work. That was an ethical knot that society would struggle with. One winter evening, after a hard seasonal bout when the town seemed thinner with patience, Sear returned with what felt like a closing lesson. For months, Mark had expected a cosmic ultimatum. Instead, the presence offered a kind of procedural calculus. Our projection for your species indicates inflection points, Sear said. Human systems change when local norms become sufficiently entangled in daily practice. We calculate entanglement as repeated acts of presence across time. Entanglement grows slowly if resources for presence are available. There was a cause, a neutral cadence. You are demonstrating entanglement in pockets. Strengthen the scaffolding. Training for facilitators, integration into school curricula, household routines that normalize presence. These interventions are not mandates, they are leverage points. Mark listened as if to an auditing report. The aliens' recommendations were, in a way, banal. Training, integration, and normalization, but their banality made them feel achievable. The voice did not promise victory, it offered what it called leverage. We monitor, Sear added. We will not intervene in interior states, we only note probabilities. You will discover increased robustness if networks of presence become stable. After the visitation, Mark convened a small committee from the group to think about sustainability. They drafted a simple curriculum for teaching listening skills in community classes and offered to pilot it at the high school.
The school principal, a pragmatic woman with a weary smile who had seen youth violence rise and fall with cycles of policy, allowed a 6-week module as an experiment. The class was not a crusade. It taught breathing anchors, how to sit with a peer's confession without offering immediate fixes, and small exercises in noticing. It also included, as Mark insisted, a frank talk about limits. Presence does not guarantee outcomes. It can create conditions for resilience, but is not a cure-all. The pilot attracted enough interest that a neighboring town asked to replicate it. The movement was not a wave, but a braided set of small initiatives. Mark kept himself alert to the risk of hubris. He counseled patience, a steady, not urgent persistence. He also felt, like everyone engaged in systemic repair, the low-grade awe that comes when small acts accumulate into larger patterns. The years began to change Mark's body as much as his habits. He grew less reactive in argument, less quick to deflect pain with humor. Elena, who had always known him in his work-tied conscientiousness, now described him as softer in ways that did not emasculate him, but made him more available. They sometimes walked the neighborhood holding hands, a small public artifact of an intimate repair. The men in the circle aged alongside him. Some found solace, and others left for reasons that had nothing to do with the work. The men who stayed developed a shared language that was not coded, but human, words like bearing, returning, and attendance that stood for the practice's heart. At one point, a professional who trained in family therapy offered to bring ethical coaching to the group's facilitators. The training was matter-of-fact and useful. It did not sanctify the group, but it helped them hold boundaries. Mark learned the importance of professional referral when issues surpassed the group's capacity. He insisted, as a moral rule, that the circle provide first response and referral rather than amateur clinical intervention. This stance mirrored Sear's own clinical restraint: offer aid within capacity and respect boundaries beyond it. It was in a year of quiet accumulation that the vision of the point of no return again visited him, this time not as a stark omen, but as an invitation to rededicate the project. Sear projected an image like a documentary cut, a city that functioned, people interacting with polite but thin exchanges controlled by apps that smoothed overt displays. A preschool where emotional scripts were assessed by algorithms, neighborhoods that never witnessed a real grievance because it had been outsourced. The scene did not explode. It rendered domestic life as efficient and hollow.
In contrast, the other frame showed dispersed communities of the sort Mark had helped foster, small groups that petitioned schools to teach listening, workplaces that instituted short presence breaks, and neighborhoods where residents regularly checked in on one another, beyond weather talk. After the vision, Sear said, "We will continue to preserve physical continuity. We will not, cannot apply force to experience. The rest remains yours." It was a cosmic shrug and a call to moral agency. Mark felt in that moment both the weight of responsibility and the unusual freedom of it. No cosmic savior would force the work. Humanity had been granted time and the choice to use it. The thought pressed him forward rather than overwhelmed him. If anything, knowing the limits of help focused him on what he could do. He redoubled efforts toward durability. The committee formalized the training program and applied for a modest grant to fund a facilitator certificate open to volunteers from several towns. They emphasized accessibility and a refusal to monetize the training. They created a small council to ensure ethical practice and to hold the group's public face accountable to principles they had written on a napkin the day they started. The grant came in modest funds, enough to pay for space and printing.
The facilitator training began to spread, not because anyone planned a movement, but because people found that practicing presence made them better neighbors. Mark's own life continued to be a test in small ways. He had mornings when old habits resurfaced with a fury that made him feel unmoored. He had nights when Elena's vulnerability opened a long, dormant grief that he did not always know how to hold. He had moments in the men's group when his chest ached with the responsibility of holding other people's pain. These were not failures, they were the ordinary friction Seer had described. Mark learned to name them as such, to treat them as part of the work rather than reasons to abandon it. The ripple effects reached small civic structures. The local hospital began, tentatively, a pilot in staff debriefings that took a form similar to the group's practices: a brief period of silence, a simple check-in, a listening round. The pilot did not solve systemic healthcare strains, but nurses and technicians reported feeling less isolated after shifts. The fire chief, who had initially scoffed at the men's group, admitted in a private conversation that the listening practices had helped when the station, after a particularly traumatic call, needed something other than operational debrief. The chief did not publicize his involvement, he simply practiced. Mark's modest book, he had long since stopped imagining it as an offer and more as a record, found a publisher who admired its quiet tone. The manuscript, largely composed of field notes and personal reflections, did not promise salvation. It offered practice, warnings, and invitations.
It included stories from the group, edited for privacy, and short sections of practical instruction. Elena's edits made the language humane. The publisher took care to present the book as a practical guide rather than a panacea. When it was published, the book circulated quietly. No bestseller frenzies, only steady interest from communities and a few regional reviewers who appreciated its modesty. The book's release occasioned a small series of talks. Mark traveled to neighboring towns and spoke at libraries and community centers, always careful to frame the work as experiment and practice. He spoke about Seer's visitation only as an experience that had set him on the path, always labeling it as a narrative vision allowed to his consciousness rather than an objective fact. That rhetorical caution was not a game of semantics, it was a commitment to the story's ethical boundaries that the DNA required. This was narrative, not reportage. In the 7th year after the revelation, Seer returned one last time, not with dire charts, but with a curiosity we had not expected. The presence said, "We observe increased entanglement. Your clusters show emergent properties we did not anticipate. They demonstrate greater propagation through family structures than our models initially suggested." There was a neutral intonation that approximated surprise. Mark felt something like relief and a quiet elation. The observation was not triumph, but evidence that the small things could bear weight. Seer's tone remained clinical and cool, but there was an effect in the data it shared, a projection that if the practices persisted and the networks of facilitators matured, the probability curve for demographic atrophy could be meaningfully altered. Still, the presence closed with the same constraint. We cannot force you to feel. The choice remains yours. At a late-night meeting after Seer's final visit, the group held a simple ritual of gratitude. They lit no candles. Harold, to his credit, always joked about fire codes. But they named aloud, in the circle, the small things that had kept them returning. A hand on a shoulder, a voice that did not ridicule, a neighbor who mowed someone else's lawn after a death. The ritual was the sort of thing that might seem modest to the detached eye,
but felt monumental to the men who had, over years, learned how to carry sorrow with more fidelity. Mark's sleep, now, was less mistake and more rhythm. He still woke occasionally at strange hours. Old ghosts have long legs. But the nights passed without the on-off specter of the early years. He woke warmer to sensation, less inclined to hide from feeling. His marriage with Elena had evolved into a steadier companionableness, thickened by the work they did each night. James, who now had his own children, called with questions about how to teach his kids to be present rather than perform. They spoke of the morning silence as a family exercise, and James found, with clumsy honesty, that his son could sit for 5 minutes without devices and then ask his father a question that had real curiosity behind it. The town continued to be a mix of flattening trends and resilient pockets. Technology marched on outside their little province, offering slick substitutes and behavioral miracles. There were companies that advertised devices promising optimized emotional states and communities that gleefully adopted them. There were also small civic projects that integrated presence practices into school curricula and local health initiatives. The presence of multiple paths meant that the future would not be uniform. That heterogeneity felt, to Mark, like a good thing. Diversity of approach did not guarantee success, but it made the terrain less brittle. The ledger Sear had first given him, the stark terms of a species-level agreement, remained the axis on which he measured his modest efforts. The hidden cost, as the presence had framed it, continued to be the awareness that physical survival was purchased by an obligation to face the interior without coercion. That obligation was not melodrama. It was a steady, sometimes dull requirement that people choose, day after day, to attend to the ache that living creates. Years later, on the porch where he had first sat at 3 a.m., Mark found himself watching a sky he no longer scanned for rescue, but simply appreciated. He had the same cheap lawn chair, but the electricity of things had returned in ways he had not expected. It was not a miracle so much as a series of small repairs that yielded a quieter hum. Elena had gone inside to bring out 2 mugs of tea. The maple tree watered new leaves in the patient geometry of spring. He felt in his chest a steady pressure of gratitude complicated by fear. It always sat there, a companionable urgency. Sear appeared one final time in his experience, not as an imposition, but as a courteous auditor. "We remain observers," the presence said. "We will continue to guard physical continuity. The rest is a human responsibility." Mark had expected some cosmic verdict, some weighty command. Instead, he received the same thing he had all along: data, models, and a blunt respect for free will. "What will happen?" he asked, not to petition, but to understand. Sear answered simply, "The future is a space of choices. There will be pockets of numbness and pockets of vividness. Probability shifts," it said. "You have altered the distribution in ways that merit attention. Keep the practice, protect the ethics, teach facilitators, build durable institutions of presence. These are not guarantees. They are leverage." Mark thanked the presence, a gesture as human as any he had rehearsed.
The interaction closed not with fanfare, but with the quiet of an exchange between different kinds of intelligences, one that prioritized preservation and modeling, the other that prized moral aesthetic and small acts. The boundary between the two felt less like alienation and more like an asymmetry, different capacities and obligations. He rose from the lawn chair and went inside to Elena. They sat together, as they had learned to do, with no performance and no expectation beyond attendance. He told her about Seir's final visit,
And then, because he had learned the small courage of precise vulnerability, he said, "I'm scared, not about bombs or anything. I'm afraid we'll think practice is a banner and not a life. I'm afraid people will take the shortcuts." Elena placed her hand over his and said, "Then we'll keep doing it. Not for the numbers, for the small things. For this." She tapped the space over his heart as if to mark the ground. Mark realized then how much of the work was not public success, but domestic fidelity. The hidden cost the alien had revealed was real, and so was the remedy, but practical and unspectacular. Minutes kept, faces attended, presence offered. The engineering mind in him reconciled to a truth he had once resisted, that systems could be repaired by patience as much as by force. The last page of his notebook was not a final ledger, but an open invitation. He wrote, in a careful hand, a sentence he had been speaking aloud to others and to himself for years. Presence is a skill, not a virtue. It takes practice and a willingness to be present for the gentle work of living in the world. If you are listening to this story and it touches something inside you, there are practical steps offered here. 20 minutes each morning of silent attention, 15 minutes each night of undistracted presence with someone you love, and a weekly group devoted to honest conversation. These are not cures, they are small practices that build capacity over time. If you want to learn more, the booklet and resources mentioned below offer simple starters and guidance for forming local circles. Mark did not imagine himself a savior. He imagined, instead, a man who had been given a strange accounting of his species' fate and had chosen to answer with small, steady acts. The hidden cost the alien had revealed remained visible on nights when the world threatened to flatten feeling into quiet automation. Yet the story was not only about loss. It was also about the stubborn possibility that people could choose presence, and in the choosing, alter probability. On the porch at dawn, the cheap clock ticked in a steady, ungrandiose rhythm. Mark inhaled and held the breath for a small length of time, then released it. Elena came out with 2 mugs. He took one and, without ceremony, placed his hand over hers. They sat together and kept the minutes. Nothing theatrical, nothing grandiose, just the ordinary audacity of being present. The alien had revealed a ledger that humanity's physical continuity had been bought with time and the responsibility to face inner emptiness. The cost was clear. The remedy, in its humble form, was clearer still. Choose presence, day after day. The decision lay with human hands. If you want to go deeper, there is a modest resource linked below that expands on these practices and offers guidance for forming small groups and facilitator training. It is not a promise, it is a tool. The choice remains yours, to keep the minutes, to sit in the hard silences, to show up.